Hello and welcome to this week's presentation for Understanding Transitional Justice. This week we're going to be talking about the question of whether it is better to sacrifice some elements of what is called justice, especially in the form of criminal prosecution, punishment, that is retributive justice, in order to receive fuller accounts of what is called truth. That is, all of the details of events that might need to be remembered for the purpose of maintaining an accurate account, but also for the purpose of prevention of future occurrences and for social reconciliation. So we call this the truth versus justice debate, although it's probably necessary to specify in the beginning that when we say truth and when we say justice, what we're actually referring to are some very narrow interpretations of both of those terms. The question is usually raised in the context of disputes over offering amnesties, and this question arises whether what we're talking about are partial amnesties offered in exchange for providing information, or general amnesties that have as their goal reducing the levels of tension and fear and contention in the social environment. Probably a lot of the origin of the debate comes from the experience of South Africa and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, we have talked a lot already about the decision that was made in South Africa in the 1990s to, rather than pursuing a process of investigation and criminal prosecution, to pursue a truth commission. One of the things that we've specified in the context of this discussion is that this was partly the result of a political agreement in which the apartheid regime agreed to hold elections and to leave power in exchange for amnesty from prosecution. That's part of the story, but there are some other ways in which South Africa in the 1990s is a little bit unique. There is one particular incident in the experience of South Africa that is probably especially important for the truth versus justice debate, and that is the experience of the case of Stephen Biko. Stephen Biko was a major political activist, some would say legendary, who was killed by police in the 1970s. The family of Stephen Biko sued the state of South Africa, and their argument in the suit was that the state did not have the right to provide amnesty to the perpetrators of the killing, because this eliminated the right of the family to seek justice for the killing. And the case went all the way through the courts. Eventually, the South African Constitutional Court ruled, and they ruled in favor of the state. They said the right of the state to provide amnesty does outweigh the right of the family to seek justice if the state determines that an amnesty is in the public interest. And of course, in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was a general immunity for prosecution, but there was also the promise of amnesty that was involved in the process, in which particular perpetrators could request amnesty, could request forgiveness, and in exchange for a full account of the facts. And in this environment, it was up to the families of victims or victims themselves, if they were available, to decide whether to give forgiveness or not. But perpetrators did have the right to ask for forgiveness. Now, one of the things that we can probably say about this process of using amnesty to enhance the ability to gather information is we can say that the conflict over this strategy plays out in a lot of different ways. Now, in South Africa, in many other environments, we can talk about genuine concerns that motivated the provision of amnesty. And part of this was a political agreement, but also a very strong motivation is the fear of consequences of long processes of investigation and prosecution that will endanger people and that will have the effect of heightening social tension. So there are genuine concerns that could lead to what I suppose you might call a legitimate decision to provide amnesty. There are also what could be called cynical concerns and cynical efforts, in which the state engages in a process of truth seeking in order to avoid a process that could potentially be more risky or endanger more the legitimacy of the state. That is, a process to do truth instead of justice, or to avoid one obligation by accepting a smaller obligation. Now, we discussed one of the major criticisms of this approach last week. That is that there is a problem then with what is anticipated as being a partial or tendentious character of the truth that is told. It's also important to keep in mind in this discussion that the conditions under which provisions of amnesty happen sometimes represent a moral stance, but more frequently represent a restraint that is imposed either by a negotiated transfer of power or that represents a response to a perceived threat. But one thing that we can say is that the preference for truth over justice is most often carried out in the name of reconciliation. So in the next segment, I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation, what's involved in it, and what are some of the problems of reconciliation.